Welcome to Inside the Skev, and I'm your host, Aaron Masliansky. Today I bring you Dr. Eric James, who is a distinguished figure in the realm of international development and humanitarian aid. He has a career that has spanned over 3 decades, starting over at ETHS here in Evanston and going around the world. He has worked for several government agencies, done work with the United Nations, just really is the innovator in the space. He's the author of Managing Humanitarian Relief, an operational guide for NGOs, and he does a lot of work to help transform the way that countries can recover after disasters by creating what they need on site. This is through his company called Field Ready. Fascinating conversation and a wonderful reason of why this is such a great area. Before we start today's episode of Inside the Skev, I want to introduce myself. I'm Aaron Masliansky, not just the voice behind Inside the Skev, but also a local real estate expert deeply ingrained in the Skevinson community. As a lifelong resident, my connection to this area runs deep, and since 2011, I've been helping people buy and sell homes here. My expertise has expanded across Chicagoland with over 30 homes sold in 2023 alone, a testament to the growth of the Masliansky real estate team. At Dreamtown Real Estate, we combine in-depth local knowledge with a broad understanding of the Chicagoland market. Whether you're looking for a home in Skevinson or elsewhere in the region, we provide personalized service and the latest technology for a seamless experience. Ready to explore real estate opportunities or share your ideas for the show? Visit skevinson.com or reach out directly. Now, let's start the show. Eric, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is a real treat because I got to meet you at the Rotary Club of Evanston's meeting, which I'm a part of. You came to speak about your organization, Field Ready, and all the work that you've been doing in international development. And you live here in Evanston. So it's like all these different things that like just fireworks went off in my head about how interested I am to learn about what you do, given my background, where I have a degree in international development, but I work here in Evanston selling real estate. And I feel like there's so much that I can learn from you and my audience can learn from you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, and thanks for the kind words.
My pleasure. So how did you get into this? Because you grew up here in Evanston, right? And how did you start to think about doing a career in international development?
Yeah, I have to think back, but it really started with a desire to travel, to not just sort of work in an office. I didn't even really know what that meant. And it's a desire to, see what else there was going on in the world. I always knew that there were people who weren't as well off as we are in Evanston, um, things like disasters and conflict and so on always had some fascination for me. So as soon as I could, I took a degree from Champaign and then went to Washington. And even when I was working in DC, I realized, hey, there's a lot more interesting things going on out around the world. And luckily since then I've had a chance to work my way up with different nonprofits around the world, and really have gotten to see some of the things that are in the headlines firsthand, and work on those.
Where are some of the places that you've gotten to go work in? I mean, how long have you been doing it for?
Yeah, really since the mid to late 90s is when I got my start. And I first spent time in the Balkans, in Bosnia, then in Central Africa and different parts of Africa throughout my career. A good amount of time in Asia as well, particularly Afghanistan. But as rapid onset disasters have happened, like the tsunami in Sri Lanka and conflicts like in East Timor, I was there. And then more recently, I've done a little bit of work in our hemisphere here, but not much. I spent time in Haiti right after the earthquake in 2010. I've had many trips back since that time. But most of my work has been focused in farther parts of the world.
What's it like to work in those types of environments? I mean, I imagine it's pretty challenging.
It can be. I think each context, each country presents its own unique challenges. I think in some places it's feels quite normal. I've lived in apartments and had regular meals at restaurants and so on. And in other contexts, I've gone and slept on the ground and lived in camping conditions for weeks at a time and so on. So it really depends on what particular disaster or humanitarian context I've been working in. What I have found is that, in some of these places, it's people who have caused the problems, but it's also, an amazing um, experience of, seeing the best in people as well. And under, the most dire circumstances, people are managed to maintain their dignity and help others. And that's just really gratifying to see and is motivating for me.
Is there a big difference between going to somewhere where maybe it's more like a war zone, like Afghanistan? You've been to Iraq as well, right?
Yeah.
Versus going to a tsunami situation in Sri Lanka or being in Central Africa.
Yeah, certainly when there's one of these large um, natural events, the security situation tends to actually improve briefly because even if you're a criminal or a bad actor, you and your family are affected by those events. But over time, yeah, some like the place in Haiti where there's a lot of gang violence that sort of tends to spring back over time. I mean, there definitely is a different approach or way things have to be done in a very violent context. Um, it is interesting after COVID, everyone, knows the experience of sheltering in place and even that language is now common. But in conflict zones or working in the places I have over the years, that's fairly common to hibernate, to wait out the violence when it is time, safe enough to go back out. So a lot of them are common sense precautions, but there is, some kind of technical work that needs to be done to maintain safety and security in these kinds of places.
Now, you've gotten to see how things work with being able to uh, get procurement of different items and things that people need throughout the world and just how that system works. And you were talking about that when you came and spoke to our Rotary Club. And there's different ways that you've found that can be improved. Tell us a little bit about some of those challenges with getting things to the locations that need it quickly.
Yeah, by and large, the humanitarian community follows a lot of the same models of supply chain management that are used, all over the world, and people benefit from that greatly. There are challenges though. There's not like, Amazon Prime in the places that we're talking about
That would be
here.
nice.
Yeah, it would save a lot of problems, but you need a lot of infrastructure. It costs a lot of money to do that and so on. And what we're talking about are countries that, by and large have very high levels of vulnerability and poverty and so on. And so when there's uh, natural hazards like an earthquake or a tropical storm, or in fact that there's violent conflict going on, you can't benefit from that kind of infrastructure. Uh, and so we have to look at better ways to do that. And one of the things we're doing at Field Ready is localizing the manufacturing. And largely what that means is bypassing those big supply chains and making things on the spot. And what we found is that's better, faster, cheaper than the current alternative.
And I mean, is that you've done a lot of research in the topic? You're a professor, taught in a lot of places. You've written books about it. Managing humanitarian relief is, one of it's a great resource for the sector. Is a lot of the research that you've done, has that led you to what you're doing now with Field Ready?
For me, I've largely done those hand in hand or in tandem. So I've been lucky in my career to sort of take time off and go back to school or to actually use some of the time off I have to do research or to teach classes and so on. And what I found is that really is strengthening what I do. And in fact, a wise professor told me one time that, he actually learns more in the class than the students do, and I've taken that away with me. And I try and pass on all I can, but inevitably I get sort of stronger through that process.
Absolutely. I'm sure you have. I mean it, and then some of the things though, just like an example of uh like if you're in a disaster zone and you didn't have on site, tell us a little bit about how does the product actually get to the disaster zone, and how do you come up with different type of innovative solutions to get it produced even in an area that is very challenging.
Yeah, well, normally again, there's supply chains when a country doesn't have what it needs. It brings it from the outside, or even regionally when certain items. And I'm talking about everything from food to things like plastic sheeting and buckets and kitchen sets and hygiene items and so on. So all those things, if they're not available in a country, have to be brought in. Um, now, some of those can be made locally. Sometimes there's, equipment that is there, particularly in the medical field. You can imagine like, an expensive EKG machine that maybe has one little part that becomes broken. And well, those can be made on the spot using different types of technology. And we've demonstrated that over and over again, particularly in Northwest Syria, for example, where, the country's been at war for over a decade, and there are besieged areas where you can't just simply go in and out. And our teams have actually made and fixed and repaired different items, including medical items that really benefit a lot of those people that have been war affected. In fact, even by the earthquake that happened about a year ago.
And you were telling us in the club about how you're able to even figure out how to create items to lift up rubble to be able to get people out. Tell us about that.
That's right. So there's search and rescue teams were being really frustrated because they need specialized equipment to lift tons of rubble. And yeah, you can bring in diggers or use hands and so on, but these are really sort of technical, technically difficult areas to work in. And what you need is something small that raises that rubble just enough so you can rescue people who are buried alive. And this was happening primarily because of the indiscriminate bombing that was taking place in the country, but also that happens in earthquakes as well. And so using a variety of product development methods, we, basically made airbags using compressed air and the locally available materials. We made these, they're kind of like pillows, and they just raise the rubble just enough to enable people to rescue others. So we've done that in Northwest Syria, and it's saved many lives. We've also replicated that in other countries like Nepal.
It's incredible. And I mean, it's almost like you guys are the MacGyver of international development. And I mean, is it just how do you gather these ideas, and who's coming up with these things, and how do you test it and be able to not waste time on the field?
Yeah, in a couple different ways. So one is just being there on the spot, working shoulder to shoulder with other people, and really, relying on local knowledge first and foremost, and then working from the problem itself or what people need, but also considering their resources, their talents, the opportunities we have to work with others. We work back from that, and then only at the end do we realize, okay, could we use this technology or that? So we're not a problem looking for a solution. We're working from the problem backwards. Now, in some cases, it can be, quite rudimentary. We've made things like privacy screens and congregate living settings where people have been displaced and living suddenly, in gymnasiums and things like that. Very basic things.
Sure.
In some, like the the airbags that we were just talking about, we actually used more of a method that, if anyone's seen Apollo 13 or knows the story, because it's true, you had the space capsule had some problems, and you had a set number of people, the astronauts in the space capsule, and with a set number of things that were known in the up there with the astronauts. And what they did was they took engineers and sequestered them in a room and said, "This is what the astronauts have. Work with them." And luckily, this is one of the great benefits of being human, right? Is that we work together as a team. And that extra brain power was able to be shared with the astronauts, and they were able to problem solve that way. So in much the same way, sometimes we have people working on the outside of these problems, trying to figure out what can be done, and then sharing that knowledge and doing things like testing and so on. And that really amplifies the work that our teams do on the ground.
You've got the Gary Sinises back wherever you are. I love that part of the movie and that part of the real story that they were able to figure that out and how to get Apollo 13 home. But it's such a great example of being able to, teamwork, even if you're not right there in place. And I think that part of that is the advancements in technology to be able to work remotely. I mean, I think many of us have seen how remote work has transformed everything, through the pandemic and now. But that's been going on for a while. But some of the other technology that you're working with is like 3D printing. I mean, because if you need different pieces, you could 3D print that product. So have you been placing that in different areas that you're working in?
Yeah, we have used 3D printing or additive manufacturing more broadly. For us, we see that more as a tool in our toolbox. It allows a great amount of flexibility, and you can use the same printer to make many different types of things. So we can cross over, say, from health to water and sanitation to fixing just things in the office, whereas most other technology doesn't work that way. If an injection molder makes what's in the mold, and that's it. And so, but we use all sorts of technologies and so on because of that methodology that I talked about, starting with people and their problems and how we can positively, in fact, impact their lives, and then working backwards from there.
Yeah. One of the cool things I saw in your bio, and we briefly talked about this, is that you got to go to the Singularity University, which is Ray Kurzweil's brainchild, and you get to meet with different people there and learn about different types of futurism or futurist technology. What have you taken away from that experience to be able to use with what you're doing now?
Yeah, well, you could say, in a sense, Field Ready has two parents. One is the kind of situations that we're talking about, disaster zones and refugee camps and so on. But the other parent was Singularity University. It was being exposed in Silicon Valley to all the different technology trends and different ways of thinking and so on. And it was those two married up that was like, well, we could try and start a new company that focuses on a widget, maybe an app that people just play with, or we could do something that was truly transformational and has social impact. And that's what Field Ready has become.
It's amazing. How many locations are you working in Field Ready, and where's it all based?
Yeah, so we're in about half a dozen countries at the moment. We are working to scale that more broadly. We are registered as a charity or nonprofit in those countries, or most of them anyway. And so we worked in a very distributed way. I think everyone's now familiar with remote working, and that's we were doing that before the pandemic, and that's just the way we work largely.
Right. And you're here in Evanston, which I think is just awesome. And I think just shows how this area is so connected to the solution to, what we face around the world. And, you've been recognized for your efforts by Rotary International's Humanitarian Star Award. And how do you see the role of organizations like large nonprofits like Rotary in supporting humanitarian work?
Yeah, well, I I think I was alluding to this earlier that this is all a real team effort. There is no single group that sort of has it, or if they're ever on an interview and they say we're the only ones here, I can assure you that's not the case.
Yeah,
Uh, you know, any organization that's implementing programs on the ground is doing so because of the different talents that are brought to bear, the different resources through donations and grants and so on. And so Rotary has a real global reach and is able to support a variety of different efforts. And their model is great where people on the ground identify what kinds of things they can support. So there's a lot of potential synergy between all these groups and doing more to help the people who were most in need.
right. So even these groups and the government groups, I mean, the combined power of that could really affect the change of what you need to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, generally, this field is significantly under-resourced. If you look at any of the United Nations appeals for humanitarian assistance, they're only about half funded. And anyone who works in the nonprofit sector knows there's never just enough money. So I would encourage people to understand how difficult this work is and how much accountability there is to the highest standards and everything like that. But that this is we're facing situations right now that are really pretty dramatic when you just look at the headlines right now, and
Sure.
there's just so much work to be done in this area.
Yeah, I mean, you look at like you said, look at the headlines. There's problems everywhere. There's problems, Israel, Gaza, throughout the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia, um, at multiple places in Africa. I mean, in South America, even here in the United States, there's crises. And given your extensive background in development work, why do you think this is happening, and how do you work effectively in a multipolar environment where you maybe have, America and its allies, you have Russia, China, and you just have different actors that it's not just a unipolar world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't want to stray too far into the big macro pictures. I think, part of it's just ebb and flow of history. I think, I think it does point to how front and center and frankly lively that some of the historical debates are even to this day. I mean, what the nature of government is, and the fact that there's still fascism and things like that in our world that really truly causes pain with others. It's not just oh, that happened along somewhere else, or we're all interconnected. And so for me, if somebody well, if I could say, it's sort of like what Martin Luther King said, a threat to injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. And so if somebody is out suffering somewhere, I'm connected to that. And I can't just say, well, it's not my problem and those kinds of things. We have to be cognizant that the world is a place in need of betterment, and we should be trying to, be the change we want to see in the world.
Right. And I mean, but can you operate in any environment, or do you have to be accepted into by the government that's there?
Yeah, at a basic level, yeah. So the international humanitarian law says that whoever is governing that country is first and foremost responsible for the humanitarian assistance in the place that they govern. So any country that we're working in at a basic level, there's generally a registration process, just like there is here to become a 501(c)(3) or whatever. You have to go through a process. In rapid onset cases where that hasn't happened yet, there's usually a grace period or an ability to work with partners and that kind of thing. Now, in some cases, like Syria, where the country is divided, we've been working in those areas not controlled by the central government. That doesn't mean we wouldn't mind working in the other areas. It's just also resources. We're not the United Nations or the Red Cross, where we can work anywhere we want. We have to pick and choose somewhat. Now, in other cases, it's also about the right time. And so, we've been looking at the situation in Gaza, and it's, everyone I've talked to, who has partners there or is from the region itself says, it's physically impossible at the moment. The military operations are ongoing, and it just wouldn't be, it wouldn't physically be possible. So it's all about picking and choosing with what resources we have, what kind of impact we can make, and what kind of partners and people we can do things on the ground.
Right. And I think that part of like what your mission is, from what I can gather, is, not just being the crisis managers there, but also trying to make these places resilient, because you're going to have natural disasters uh, occurring. You can't prevent it. There's a tornado, there's an earthquake, there's a tidal wave. No, wars, maybe there's things that we can do as humans to try to prevent. And but even still, there's only so much that we as an individual can do. So how do you make places more resilient to these types of disasters?
Well, largely the nonprofits, the NGOs that work in these places work at the community level. So we do it at a very locational based approach. In some cases, we do try to affect policy. We work with government where we have the resources and that's set up. So in the South Pacific, which regularly has tropical cyclones or hurricanes, and there's a lot of vulnerability on some of the remote islands and so on. That's a place where we can both try to influence policy, particularly around localizing our approach, but then also doing things directly with the communities on the ground. There's other groups that, like the UN, like different governments, bilateral relationships that do work at a higher level, but generally the nonprofit organizations work much more people to people.
Yeah. So you can figure out what they actually need. And if you're going to be having a cyclone every year, okay, what types of things, supplies do we need to be able to get through the main crisis portion until we can get back to life, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. In our case, our program in the South Pacific is focused on risk reduction. So our sort of steady state activities are looking at putting capabilities in place, not just sort of stockpiling things, but instead training people, making sure that the different tools and technologies are in place so that when there is one of these storms that comes by, or if they're dealing with, a sea level change, that they're able to do things locally without saying, okay, there's been a big storm, we have all these different problems now. We're going to wait for the ships and planes to come in. Instead, okay, that's happened. The resilience part is that we can now do these things ourselves, that we have an ability to make things right here without waiting for that outside help to come in. And that's what really our focus is.
Yeah. It's almost like having just-in-time manufacturing available on site instead of having large inventories. I mean, if you look at COVID, about what happened there, um, and people, I mean, you could Monday morning quarterback all day long on COVID. We didn't have enough masks. We didn't have enough gowns. We didn't have, all these different types of things, but we were able to make a vaccine pretty quickly because we had the technology to be able to figure that out and be able to look at the DNA strands. We're able to ramp up manufacturing of masks and all these different types of things, you know, in time. But I mean, do you think that there is value to stockpiling different types of things? I mean, should every community have that, or do you have to have your own manufacturing base? Because if you're, let's say, a remote island, let's say you're Fiji, you're not going to have the same type of manufacturing capability that China does. So, like, what types of things do you pick to stockpile and have at the ready? And what types of things do you need to have to be able to produce in a moment's notice?
Yeah, this really gets to the heart of the matter. And I think there's a few important things to distinguish here. And one is stockpiling or pre-positioning supplies is a sound logistical approach. I mean, it's common and so on. It does take planning and resources. Now the planning is one thing, but the resources to spend money and then have those items sit there that, maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. And then to have, most items expire or they'll be exposed to spoilage or what have you. If those are going to be used on a regular basis and rotated out and you have all the resources in place, then that's a very good strategy. And that's largely what we do in the US, right?
Right.
Because even things like, I mean, certainly pharmaceuticals, we all know, after 6 to 12 months, whatever, they'll expire. But even things like face masks and so on, will need to be replaced. On the, remote islands or these places that are, they don't, maybe mountain communities may be affected by conflict. The ability to make things is pretty astounding. Not everything needs to be made in China. There's an ability, even in a place like Fiji, they have different types of manufacturing. Now, what they don't have necessarily is the resources to also make those specific items needed after disaster happens. So they may have an injection molding machine, but they may not have the specific molds or the tools, as engineers call them, for those items because they're quite expensive. And again, you're talking about putting in money or capital and then not having it useful. So the idea is that by working together, by having the tools and the resources in place for when there is a disaster, you work together with what resources there already are. So in this case of injection molding, we've done that with a specific type of bucket that is needed in these relief situations. And working with a local company, you see the partnership there, that they have their regular, steady state business that's going on, but then they're able to shift and meet the demand of a disaster because we're assisting and working with them. And in this case, the communities are affected, but then it's the groups like UNICEF and the different foreign governments and even the line ministries themselves, and all work together to make sure that ability to localize the manufacturing is taking place. And that's part of the policy level things that we're working on.
Right. To try to get those local manufacturers able to switch over immediately, almost like the Defense Production Act in the United States, to be able to have different companies switch over and be able to make what we need in an emergency situation.
That's right. And it's really about the capability. The way to do that is what's important, not just pre-positioning it, but having that capability to do things rapidly.
Right. That's how you make things resilient. Because it's like on one hand, yeah, you could wait for the massive ship to come by or the plane to drop off everything, but then that becomes a problem. And also that becomes a problem where you look at different things of graft or waste, where like in Haiti, you've operated in Haiti. And from what I read in the headlines is that it's a pretty lawless situation right now, where they're asking for foreign governments to come and station troops because they can't get things under control. So, I mean, how do you operate within a zone like that? And do you see any progress being made there?
Yeah, it's anyone's guess, and it's a tragic situation in Haiti. I haven't been to the country now in several years, so I wish the best for them. I know they are getting some outside support soon. But in more generally in a country like that, there's there's ways to do things. There's imagine even at some of the worst of times in places like Haiti or Afghanistan or what have you, kids go to school, restaurants open, businesses function. Sometimes they have to close because of particular events and so on, but life starts to move on, even if there's bad actors and fighting and so on. And so it's about working with those groups that have to move forward in some way and finding ways to work. So that's the key to people's resilience. And as I was saying earlier, that's what's amazing is that people are able to get through these situations, even regardless of how dire they are.
Yeah, it is amazing. You know, you look back, you've been doing this now since you said the mid 90s, right? What are some things that you look at that have changed or have surprised you within the international development space from when you started as a, you know, young guy getting in this field?
Well, I mean, for my going back to my own journey, just very briefly, I started doing this work mostly because I wanted to do something different and travel and adventure and all those things. More and more, it's become important to me, uh, less about that than about really helping other people. And as corny as that sounds, it is really trying to make you know, an impact, a positive impact on with other people and working with them towards their own solutions is really what this is all about for me. So what's very gratifying is that that's still possible, but on the big picture side, the fact that some of these countries and places and communities are some cases not better off, or they've slipped back into sort of old habits and so on. And a lot of that has to do with systems, but then also some of the people not being able to break out of the conflict they're in, or address the different vulnerable situations. And that's we're not so out of it in our own country with what happens in some communities and what some leadership does in this country doesn't make things better, and that's disappointing to see.
Right.
So there's still a lot of work to be done, I guess, at the end of the day.
You know, I talk to different people and you look at different headlines and things like that. Things don't always improve, and it can be very frustrating and depressing, frankly. But if you're doing the good work and you can see change with individuals and you know that like the there the good deed itself is a good thing. I mean, and having a career with impact like that, I think it could make a full life. I mean, do you feel that way even if not everything has changed in the world, but I'm sure you've probably helped thousands of people through or more through the disasters that you've been able to help them through.
Yeah, I mean, on a good day, I can feel like that. On most
Yeah.
days, I feel like I'm not doing enough, and I wish I was making a bigger impact. Um, so I appreciate you talking to me and trying to get this message out that there's, for those of you who may be new in your career, I hope this is a good example. Or, if you're thinking about changing careers, there's a lot to be done. And if those of you who support this kind of work, thank you. Again, it's a team effort. And, while some of people have been able to work on the more, pointy side of the stick, there's a lot of people supporting them. And that's really important, even if you're making a small contribution.
Yeah. And now let's say you're an ETHS student right now in Evanston Township High School for those listening and aren't in Evanston or anywhere else, actually. How do you like what would your path be for them? How would you go through high school, go to college in order to be able to get into this field?
Yeah, the good thing is these days it's pretty easy to find out that information. When I was back in the day when I was at ETHS, I had no idea this really existed. I didn't know what an NGO was. No one talked about this as a career. It's a growing field with if there's no other takeaway from this talk is that there's a lot of need and unfortunately. So, uh, you know, there's sort of two broad paths, and one is to go and get specific skills in that you might bring, like being an engineer or being in healthcare or what have you. There is more of a generalist path, and that's more the path I took, studying things like social science, some political science, history, international development, or getting a specialized degree in how to administer or manage these projects, which ends up being office work like proposal writing and things like that. But so there's a varied path to get there. And I think one of the most important things is to really try to understand things on the ground. So making sure that some practical experience is gained as you develop and start a career in this, and just not try to sort of start at the top and then go from there, because it's about understanding people and their problems most of all.
Would you recommend somebody do Peace Corps?
Yeah, I think Peace Corps is a great thing that our country does, frankly. There's a couple other countries that have tried to, replicate it or, in their own way, but it's a great idea that gives that sort of exchange and on the ground experience that people can really use. And I think those relationships, even if a volunteer never goes back years later, help our country in a lot of ways. So I'm proud of what they do.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible sacrifice to be able to do that, but it's highly interesting. I almost think about doing it maybe once my kids are off to college or past that, or in those years with my wife. So we'll see. Now, if somebody wants to be able to support the work that you're doing or find your books, where should they go?
Well, Field Ready's website and on the social media is probably the easiest way, fieldready.org. And there's all the regular buttons to click on there. If anyone's interested in some of my writing, I have ericbooks.com, which details some of my books and where to get them and so on.
And those books are really good for, is it good for like a practitioner, or is it good for anyone who's interested in international development?
Yeah, they're more technical and for those who are working in the field. So I am looking or starting to think about, telling some of the stories in more of a narrative form that would be for a wider general audience, but that's still to come.
Okay. Well, we'll stay looking at what you're doing, and thanks for living here in the Skev. It's pretty awesome in Evanston. But Eric, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.